The net snapped taut across the harbor rocks, and Elijah Ford lunged for it before the whole catch could slide back into the boiling green water. And that was when the rope tangled around his boot and the world tipped sideways. He hit the shallows hard, salt water and steam-warmed brine filling his mouth, the volcanic tide pool hissing around him where the hot springs bled into the sea. Fish flopped against his chest, silver and thrashing, and above him he heard a voice like a rockslide laughing. "You throw yourself into my catch like a man drowning for love of it, little Smith." Elijah spat out water and looked up into the face of the most striking woman he had ever seen. And she was an orc, standing thigh-deep in the tide pool with a diving net looped over one powerful shoulder, her green-gray skin gleaming with sea water and the low orange light of the volcano's steam vents behind her. She wore fitted sealskin diving leathers, cinched tight at the waist with a wide belt. The bodice laced high enough for modesty, but cut close enough to show the strength coiled beneath. Her dark hair bound back in a thick braid threaded with small bone beads that clicked when she moved. Tusks caught the light when she grinned down at him, not cruel but delighted, amused down to her bones. "I was trying to save your net," Elijah managed, hauling himself upright, fish sliding off his soaked shirt and flopping back toward the water. He grabbed for them without thinking, cradling 3 against his ribs like a fool. "It looked to be dragging you under. I have hauled netfuls of shark bigger than you, human." She waded closer, water sluicing off her, and crouched to gather her catch with quick, competent hands, not once looking away from him. "You waded into a harbor pool to rescue my dinner." "I did not wade, I fell." "You fell very heroically." Her eyes were a deep amber flecked gold where the steamlight struck them, and they raked over him with open, unhurried appraisal that made his ears burn hotter than the spring water around them. "What is your name, fish thief?" "Elijah Ford. I keep the forge up on Anvil Row." He held out the fish he'd caught, awkward, dripping, feeling like a boy caught stealing apples. "These are yours." She took them from his hands, but she did not step back. Close up she was easily a head taller than him, broad through the shoulder in a way that spoke of years hauling nets and diving the deep kelp beds beyond the harbor mouth, and there was a puckered old scar along her forearm, pale against green-gray skin, that told of some fight survived. She smelled of brine and hot mineral water and something warm underneath that, like cedar smoke. "Mazoga Stonefist," she said, and it was less an introduction than a small, teasing challenge, as if daring him to do something with the name besides flinch. "You are the bladesmith, then. I have heard of you. They say your steel holds an edge longer than any smith's from the lowland towns." "I try." He was aware, suddenly, of how he must look, half-drowned and fish-scaled in the middle of Sable Vent's public harbor pool, in full view of the market stalls and the bathhouse steps where a dozen townsfolk had already stopped to stare. Some of the stares were curious. A few, aimed at Mazoga, were not kind. She noticed them too. He watched something shudder behind her amber eyes, quick and practiced, the ease draining out of her posture like water through her fingers. She straightened to her full height, net over her shoulder again, chin lifted, every inch of her daring the onlookers to say something. None of them did. But an old woman on the bathhouse steps drew her shawl tighter and murmured to her neighbor, loud enough to carry. "Orc divers getting bold, flirting with decent men in the open pools." Elijah felt his face go hot for an entirely different reason. He turned toward the old woman before he decided to. "She pulled a net full of fish out of that water with her own 2 hands while the rest of you watched from dry stone," he said, louder than he meant to. "I'd call that a decent morning's work, not boldness." The old woman's mouth pinched shut. Mazoga looked at him sideways, surprised, something flickering across her face that was gone before he could name it. "You did not need to do that," she said, quieter now just for him. "I know," he shrugged, feeling the fish scales drying stiff on his shirt. "Didn't stop me." "No," she agreed, and there was the ghost of that grin again, softer this time. "It did not." She turned and waded out of the tide pool toward the market stalls where the fish buyers waited, her catch swinging heavy in the net. and Elijah stood there soaked to the bone in the steaming shallows of Sable Vent's harbor, watching her go, feeling something in his chest that he had no name for yet and did not particularly want one for. Sable Vent was not a town that welcomed outsiders easily, human or orc, but it welcomed skill, and it welcomed steel, and Elijah's forge had earned him a wary sort of respect over the 4 years he had lived there. The town sat in a volcanic valley where hot springs bled up through cracked black rock and fed a harbor thick with steam even on cold mornings, and the whole place smelled of sulfur and salt and wood smoke, a smell Elijah had come to think of as home. The mountains around the valley were the only border between the old human holdings to the south and the Orc clan territories to the north, and Sable Vent existed in the uneasy middle of that border, a trading town where both peoples came to buy and sell, and mostly to keep to themselves. Elijah had come north 4 years ago with nothing but his father's tools and a debt he could not pay in the lowlands, and he had built his forge on Anvil Row with his own hands, plank by plank, and he had never once, in all that time, expected to fall face first into an orc diver's fishing net and lose his footing in every sense that mattered. He thought about her that whole night, hammering out the last of a hunting knife's tang by lantern light, the rhythm of the hammer doing nothing to drown out the memory of her laugh, low and rolling like distant thunder, or the particular gold of her eyes in the steamlight. He told himself it was foolishness. Orc and human did not mix in Sable Vent, not really, not beyond trade and courtesy. There was too much old war between their peoples, too many raided farms and burned watchtowers in the grandparents' stories, even here at the border where things were supposed to be calmer. He had heard the whispers already, the old woman's voice at the bathhouse steps. He knew what it would cost a woman like Mazoga Stonefist to be seen too friendly with a human smith, and what it might cost him besides. He told himself all of that, and then he went to the harbor the next morning anyway, because he could not seem to help it. She was there again, of course, thigh-deep in the tide pool with her diving net, her sealskin leathers darkened with water, her braids slicked back. This time she saw him coming before he'd said a word, and she straightened, one hand on her hip, that grin already forming. "Back for more fish, Smith, or did you come to fall in again? I came to buy your catch if you'll sell it." He held up a small pouch of coin, feeling absurdly formal about it. "Word is you're the best diver working the vent pools." "Word is right." She waded closer, studying him. "You do not look like a man who eats much fish. You look like a man who forgets to eat it all, buried in that forge of yours." "I eat." "You eat iron filings and hope from the look of you." But she was smiling when she said it, and she tossed him a fat silver-scaled fish from her net without waiting for his coin, and when he fumbled to catch it and nearly dropped it in the shallows again, she laughed outright, a sound that seemed to startle even her. That became the shape of it, over the weeks that followed. He came to the harbor most mornings before the forge fires needed tending, and she was there more often than not, diving the deep pools where the volcanic vents warmed the water and drove the fish up shallow and slow, easy pickings for a diver strong enough to hold her breath against the mineral currents. She teased him without mercy about his pale human skin, his stubborn refusal to eat properly, the singed patches on his shirts from forge sparks. He teased her back about her terrible aim when she threw fish at him to test his reflexes, about the bone beads in her hair that she claimed were trophies and he suspected were simply pretty. It was easy between them in a way he had not expected, easy and sharp-edged at once, like a blade honed fine. She did not soften herself for him, did not pretend to be less than she was, and he found he did not want her to. She would stride into the shallows with her chin lifted and her shoulders back, daring the whole harbor to have an opinion about an orc woman speaking freely with a human smith. And more than once he saw her clock the stares, the murmurs, and simply not care, or care so fiercely that not caring was its own kind of armor. He learned in pieces that she had come south from her clan territory 3 years back. After a dispute over a chieftain's decree, she would not name outright, only that it had to do with who she was and was not willing to be given to. She dove the vent pools for the fish trade because it paid well and because, she said, the sea did not care what blood ran in a person's veins, only whether they could hold their breath and their nerve. He told her about his father's forge in the lowlands, burned in a border raid he barely remembered, about the debt that had chased him north, about the 4 years of solitary hammering that had built Anvil Row's forge into something steady beneath his hands, even as it had left him mostly alone in the evenings, mostly friendless beyond polite trade. She listened to that part particularly closely. He noticed, her amber eyes going thoughtful in a way that made him feel unexpectedly transparent. "You are lonely," she said once, not unkindly, sitting on the black rocks above the tide pool with her net drying beside her while he waited for her catch to finish settling in its baskets. "I keep busy." "That is not the same thing, Smith." She looked at him sideways, and there was something almost gentle in it, for all her sharp teeth and her scarred forearms. "I know the shape of it. I wear it too some days." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she let the silence sit between them easy as an old friend, and that, more than any of the teasing or the fish tossed at his head, was when he first understood that whatever was happening between them was not a passing thing. The first time he touched her was an accident, or he told himself it was. She had come up from a deep dive gasping, hauling a net so heavy with fish that even her considerable strength strained against it, and he had waded in without thinking to help her drag it the last few feet to shore, his hand closing over hers on the rope. She went still. He went still, the net forgotten between them, fish thrashing against their ankles in the shallow, warm water, steam curling up around them from the vents beneath the pool. "Elijah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name instead of *Smith or fish thief *, and something in the way she said it, low and rough, made his whole chest go tight. "Mazoga." He did not let go of her hand. She looked down at where their fingers were tangled together over the wet rope, then up at him, and there was a hunger in her eyes that he recognized because he felt the same thing clawing up his own throat, and for one long moment neither of them moved, the harbor sounds fading to nothing but the hiss of steam and the pounding of his own heart. Then a fish flopped hard against his shin, and the spell broke, and she laughed, sudden and startled, and pulled her hand free to grab for the escaping catch, and the moment folded itself away like something too fragile to hold in open air. But he thought about her hand in his for a long time after that, and he did not think she had forgotten it either, not from the way she looked at him the next morning, something new and considering in her gaze. The rivalry, if it could be called that, started over a knife. Mazoga wanted a proper diving blade, something short and heavy enough to cut a tangled net underwater without slowing her stroke, and she came to Anvil Row to commission it with the same directness she brought to everything, striding into his forge in her sealskin leathers with sea salt still drying in her hair, and looked over his finished work hanging on the wall with an expression of profound, insulting skepticism. "These are pretty," she said, turning one of his hunting knives over in her broad hand, testing the edge with her thumb, "for a lowland farmer's harvest work. I need something that will not fold the first time it meets bone or barnacle." "That blade could take an arm off," Elijah said, stung despite himself. "I've sold 3 of that pattern to the town guard. Town guards do not dive vent pools with sharks nosing the kelp beds." She set the knife down and fixed him with a look that was equal parts challenge and delight. "Make me something better, Smith, or admit your steel is only fit for cutting bread." "Fine," he said, feeling his own competitive streak wake up somewhere behind his ribs. "Come back in 3 days." He worked on that blade every spare hour for 3 days straight, folding the steel more times than any knife he had made before, quenching it in the mineral hot water from the springs themselves, because he had a notion the minerals might toughen the edge, testing it against everything he could find that resembled bone and shell until his forearms ached from swinging. When she came back on the 3rd evening, he handed her a short, wide-bellied diving knife with a grip wrapped in oiled leather cord, and a blade that gleamed faintly blue-gray in the lantern light. She turned it over in her hands, testing the balance, running her thumb along the flat, and then, without warning, she brought it down hard against the stone edge of his forge bench. The blade did not chip, it did not even scratch. "Well," she said, and there was real surprise in her voice, real respect chasing after it. "I take back what I said about bread. You're welcome. I did not thank you. You will." He was grinning now, unable to help it, and she was grinning back. And the air between them had gone thick and warm in a way that had nothing to do with the forge fire. "Perhaps I will thank you properly," she said, low, stepping closer, close enough that he could smell the brine and cedar smoke scent of her, close enough that his heart was hammering harder than it had against any anvil. "Perhaps you have earned it, Smith." "Mazoga," she kissed him before he finished her name, sudden and fierce, one broad hand fisting in the front of his shirt to pull him up onto his toes, and he made a startled sound against her mouth before he gave in entirely, kissing her back with a hunger that surprised him, his hands finding her waist through the sealskin leather. She tasted of salt and something sweeter underneath, and when she finally broke away, both of them breathing hard, she looked as startled by her own boldness as he felt. "That," she said, "was for the knife. I should make you more knives then." She laughed, low and delighted, and kissed him again, shorter this time but no less fierce, before she stepped back, tucking the diving blade into her belt with hands that were not quite steady. "Careful, Elijah Ford," she said, and there was real warning under the teasing now, some old caution rising back up in her eyes. "This is not a small thing, what is happening here. My clan does not forgive easily, and your townsfolk do not forget easily. We are playing with fire neither of us can put out once it catches. I've built my whole life around fire," he said. "I'm not afraid of it." "No," she agreed, quiet, searching his face like she was looking for the lie in it and not finding one. "I do not think you are." She left the forge that night with her new knife at her belt and his taste still on her mouth. And Elijah stood alone in the banked orange glow of his fire for a long time afterward, feeling like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and discovered, halfway down, that he did not particularly want to be caught. The trouble started 3 weeks later, when a war band rode into Sable Vent under a Blackhand Red banner Elijah did not recognize, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath at once. He was at the forge when he heard the commotion, the clatter of hooves on the cobbled square, and he set down his tongs and went to the door in time to see a dozen mounted orcs filing into the market square, heavily armed, their leader a broad, scarred warrior with a chieftain's braided cloak and an expression like a held blade. The townsfolk scattered to the edges of the square, wary, watching, and Elijah felt his stomach drop when he saw Mazoga among the crowd, frozen halfway between the fish stalls and the bathhouse steps, her net forgotten at her feet. "Mazoga Stonefist," the warband leader called out, his voice carrying easily across the square, "daughter of Kessa Stonefist, promised bride of Chief Thorin Ironjaw, you have run long enough. The chief calls his debt due." The square went utterly silent. Elijah felt every hair on his arms rise. "I made no promise," Mazoga said, and her voice when it came was steady, but Elijah could see the tension coiled through her whole body, one hand drifting toward the diving knife at her belt. "My mother made that promise for me before I had breath enough to argue against it. I do not honor debts I never agreed to owe." "Your mother's word binds her clan," the leader said. "You will come with us or we will take you, and the chief will decide how forgiving he feels about the manner of your return." Several of the mounted warriors moved forward, and Elijah's feet moved before his mind had finished deciding anything, carrying him out from the forge doorway and into the square, positioning himself, without quite meaning to, between Mazoga and the advancing riders. He was armed with nothing but the tongs still clutched in one hand, soot-streaked and entirely outmatched, and he knew it, and he did not care. "She said she made no promise," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Seems to me that settles the matter." The war band leader looked down at him with something between amusement and contempt, And who is this human who thinks he has a say in Orc clan business? Nobody important. Elijah did not move. Just a man who isn't going to stand here and watch you drag a woman off against her will. Elijah. Mazoga's voice was low, urgent at his shoulder now, her hand closing hard on his arm as if to pull him back. This is not your fight. They will kill you and think nothing of it. Then they'll have to. He kept his eyes on the leader, on the dozen mounted warriors, on the whole terrible weight of the moment pressing down on the square. And he was aware of the townsfolk watching from the edges, aware of every window and doorway crowded with faces, aware that whatever happened here would be talked about in Sable Vent for years. He did not let any of it move his feet. The leader's eyes narrowed. You would die for an Orc woman, human. I'd rather not die at all, Elijah said, but if it comes to that, yes. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Mazoga stepped up beside him, not behind him, her diving knife drawn now, her chin lifted in that way he had already come to love more than he wanted to admit. You will have to take us both, she said, and I promise you, Kessa's daughter does not go down easily, and neither, I think, does this one. The leader studied them both for a long moment, something calculating behind his scarred face, and then unexpectedly he laughed, short and humorless. Ironjaw wanted a bride, not a war, he said. I will not spend blood on a woman who does not want to be won, and a human smith fool enough to die for her is not worth the trouble either. But hear this, Mazoga Stonefist, the chief's pride is a longer memory than mine. This will not be the last time someone comes for you. He wheeled his horse and the warband followed, filing back out of the square as swiftly as they had come, and the whole town seemed to exhale at once, the tension breaking into a low murmur of relieved chatter and pointed stares. Mazoga turned to Elijah the moment the last rider cleared the square, and there was something fierce and raw in her expression that he had not seen before, not teasing, not guarded, just open. You are a fool, she said, a complete reckless fool, and I have never in my life seen anyone so stupidly brave. I've been called worse. I do not doubt it. She pulled him into her arms, right there in the middle of the square, in front of the whole staring town, and kissed him hard, and he felt the tremor running through her that she was trying to hide, felt how close that had come to going very differently, and he held her back just as fiercely, not caring one bit who was watching. When they finally broke apart, the square was still staring, some faces sour, some merely startled, but Mazoga did not let go of his hand, and Elijah found he did not want her to. They will come again, she said quietly against his shoulder. Ironjaw does not forgive being refused, and now he knows I have a reason to stay. Then we'll be ready, Elijah said, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in his life. The days after the warband's visit were strange, charged, half celebratory and half fearful in a way Elijah had not experienced before. Word of what he'd done spread through Sable Vent fast, and reactions split cleanly down old lines. Some of the townsfolk, mostly the older ones who remembered the border wars firsthand, gave him wary, disapproving looks when he passed, muttering about fool humans and orc troubles that were none of their business. But others, younger folk mostly, folk who had grown up trading with orc clans and diving alongside orc fishers and had less patience for old grudges, looked at him with something like respect, and a few even clapped him on the shoulder and told him he had more nerve than sense. Mazoga, for her part, stopped hiding the shape of what was between them. She came to the forge most evenings now, openly, sitting on the bench by his fire while he finished the day's work, telling him stories of her clan's diving traditions or teasing him about the state of his forge floor, and more than once their conversations dissolved into something warmer, her hands sliding into his hair, his arms circling her waist, stolen kisses in the orange firelight that left them both breathless and laughing against each other's mouths. You are going to get yourself killed one day, defending my honor in market squares, she told him one evening, tracing the calluses on his palm with idle fingers, both of them sitting close on the bench, the forge fire banked low and warm. Probably, he agreed. Worth it, though. Do not say that so easily." Her voice had gone serious, and she looked up at him with something raw in her amber eyes. "I have watched people die for less noble reasons than you would offer up your life for, Elijah Ford. I do not want to watch you die for me." "Then don't let me," he said, simple as that, and reached up to tuck a loose strand of dark hair back behind the curve of her ear, his fingers lingering against her jaw. "Stay close. Fight beside me instead of watching me fight alone. I'd rather that than either of us going it by ourselves." She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was a decision settled in them that he did not fully understand yet, though he would soon enough. "There is a thing my people do," she said slowly, "when the bond is true, not a wedding, not the kind your lowland priests would recognize. A mark given and taken between two who mean to stand together no matter what comes. It is not done lightly. It is not done in secret from your own heart or without meaning every promise underneath it." "Tell me," he said, and his heart was beating very fast. "It is a bite," she said, watching his face carefully for his reaction, "given at the joint of the shoulder and throat left by the one who claims and is claimed in turn. It scars. It does not fade. Among my people, to see such a mark on a person is to know, beyond any doubt, that they belong to another, heart and body both, and that whoever gave it will burn the world down before they let harm come to what is theirs." Elijah sat very still, absorbing that, the weight of it, the permanence. "And if I wanted that," he said slowly, "if I wanted you to give me that mark, would it be so easily undone? Would your clan see it and call off their claim on you?" "No claim from Ironjaw's line could survive a true clan mark freely given," she said. "It is older law than any chieftain's bride debt. But Elijah," she caught his hand in both of hers, urgent now, "if you take this mark, you take all of what comes with it. My clan's enemies. The stairs in this town that have not decided yet what they think of us. A life bound to a woman who will never be less than what she is, for any comfort of yours. I will not soften myself into something easier to love, even for you." "Good," he said, and meant it fiercely. "I don't want you softer. I want you exactly as fierce and stubborn and impossible as you already are. I've wanted that since you laughed at me for falling into your fishing net." Her breath caught, and something in her face cracked open, all the careful guardedness giving way at once, and she kissed him then with a desperation that told him more clearly than any words how much this had cost her to offer, how much she had feared he might refuse it. "Not tonight," she murmured against his mouth, when they finally broke apart, both breathless. "It should not be given in haste, in a forge, half undressed by firelight, however much I want it. Let me give it to you properly, when I am certain in my own heart it is not fear driving me to claim you before Ironjaw's people come again. Take whatever time you need," he said, though his whole body ached with wanting her closer. "I'm not going anywhere, Mazoga. I haven't been going anywhere since the day I fell in that tide pool." She laughed, low and warm, resting her forehead against his, and for a long moment they simply breathed together in the firelight, and Elijah thought that, whatever fear waited for them out beyond the valley's steaming rim, he had never in his life felt less alone than he did right then. The weeks that followed took on a new rhythm, charged with a kind of waiting they both tried not to speak of too directly. Mazoga still dove the vent pools each morning, still hauled her nets full of silver fish to the market stalls, but Elijah noticed she kept her diving knife strapped closer now, noticed the way her eyes swept the harbor road before she waded into the water, watching for riders under a blackhand red banner. He forged for her in his spare hours, a proper short sword this time, something better suited to a fight on land than a diving knife suited to the sea, and she trained him in turn on the black rocks above the harbor in the evenings, teaching him the grip and balance of orc fighting style, laughing when he stumbled, patient in a way that surprised him when he genuinely struggled. "You will never outmuscle an orc warrior," she told him, correcting the angle of his elbow with a firm hand. "So do not try. Use your speed. Use your wits. You have more of both than you credit yourself for, Smith." "I have a good teacher," he said, and she smiled at that, quick and pleased, before knocking him flat on his back with a sweep of her leg and standing over him grinning. "You have a teacher who does not go easy on you," she corrected, "because Ironjaw's people will not go easy either." He believed her, and 3 weeks later, on a gray morning thick with harbor fog, he learned exactly how right she had been. He was at the forge, sharpening the edge of a farmer's scythe, when he heard hooves again, more of them this time, and shouting from the direction of the harbor. He dropped the scythe and ran, his heart already in his throat, and burst out into the square to find the same black and red banner, but a different rider at its head, this time older, heavier, with a chieftain's iron circlet pressed into his brow and an expression of cold, offended fury. Chief Thorin Ironjaw himself, come south to collect his refused bride in person. Mazoga stood at the harbor's edge, her diving net dropped, her new short sword drawn, facing down a dozen mounted warriors alone, and Elijah's blood went to ice. "Mazoga Stonefist," Ironjaw said, his voice a low growl that carried across the whole square, "you have humiliated my house long enough. I did not ride south to argue. I rode south to take what was promised." "I was never yours to take," Mazoga said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a hard, bright fury that Elijah recognized because he had seen flickers of it before, banked low, waiting for exactly this moment to catch. "My mother's word does not bind my body, Ironjaw. It never did." "Your mother's word bound your clan's honor," Ironjaw said, "and I will have it satisfied, one way or another." Elijah pushed through the gathering crowd, his new sword in hand, and placed himself beside Mazoga rather than in front of her this time, shoulder to shoulder, exactly as she had once asked of him. Ironjaw's gaze slid to him with cold contempt. "The human again," he said. "Does he still think himself a match for warriors of my war band?" "I think," Elijah said, "that your war band is welcome to try me, but they'll have to go through her first, and I've seen what she can do with a knife, so I'd think carefully." A murmur went through the mounted riders, some amused, some clearly unsettled by the sheer stubborn confidence in his voice. Ironjaw's eyes narrowed. "You would still die for her," he said, "a woman who is not even your kind." "She's exactly my kind," Elijah said. "The kind worth dying for. I don't much care what blood runs in either of us." It was then that Ironjaw's gaze dropped, and Elijah realized, too late, that in the scuffle of the crowd pushing forward, in the wind gusting off the harbor and tugging at collars and cloaks, the neck of his shirt had come loose, and there, plain against his throat where it joined his shoulder, sat the mark Mazoga had given him only 4 nights before, in the privacy of his forge, under a moon that had watched them both make promises deeper than any wedding vow the lowland priests could offer. A scarred, deliberate bite, unmistakable to any orc eye for exactly what it was. The square went utterly silent. "He bears her mark," someone in the crowd breathed, and the words rippled outward, human and orc voices alike catching on the shock of it, because a claiming mark on a human throat was not a small scandalous thing here, at the border between two peoples with a hard, bloody history. It was a declaration that could not be unmade, seen now by exactly the wrong eyes at exactly the worst possible moment. Ironjaw's face went through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, fury, something almost like grudging respect before settling into a hard, flat calculation. "You gave a claiming mark," he said slowly to Mazoga, "to a human smith." "I did." Mazoga did not flinch, did not look away, one hand finding Elijah's and gripping it tight, her chin lifted in that fierce, unbreakable way that had first caught his eye in the tide pool months ago. "Freely, with my whole heart behind it and no fear driving my hand. He is mine, Ironjaw, mark and blood and promise, and no bride debt my mother spoke without my leave can undo what I have already done." Ironjaw stared at the mark on Elijah's throat for a long, taut moment, and Elijah made himself stand steady under that gaze, Mazoga's hand fierce and warm in his, the whole square holding its breath around them. "Clan law is older than bride debt," Ironjaw finally said, low and grinding as if the words cost him something. "A true mark, freely given and freely taken, ends any other claim. This is known. This is old law, older than my own chiefdom." His eyes moved from the mark to Mazoga's face, to the fierce protectiveness written plain across it, and something in him seemed to deflate, some of the cold fury draining into simple, tired resignation. "You have made your choice plain enough for any fool to see, Stonefist. I did not ride south to fight old law. I rode south for a bride who wanted binding. You do not want binding. You never did." He looked at Elijah once more, and there was no warmth in it, but there was, perhaps, something like acknowledgment. "Guard her well, Smith, or my warband's mercy today does not extend to a second visit." He wheeled his horse without another word, and his riders followed, filing out of the square in a clatter of hooves and dust, and the crowd broke into a low roar of noise the moment the last banner cleared the harbor road. Some voices outraged, some awed, some already turning to their neighbors to argue about what they had just witnessed. Mazoga turned to Elijah the instant the square was clear, her hands coming up to frame his face, searching his eyes with something between fear and fierce joy. "They saw," she said. "I did not mean for it to happen like that, out in the open, before I had even told you what it would mean if the wrong eyes found it." "I know what it means," Elijah said quietly. "You told me that first night. I chose it knowing exactly what it would cost, Mazoga. I'd choose it again 100 times over, mark and all, in front of every chieftain in the north if that's what it took. You could have died today. If Ironjaw had chosen differently, he didn't." Elijah pulled her hands from his face only to press a kiss to her knuckles, her scarred, strong fisherwoman's hands, and then he kissed her properly, slow and cert, right there in the square with half the town still watching and murmuring around them, and this time neither of them cared at all who saw. "You marked me because you meant it. I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry, the whole town knows now. Let them talk." She laughed against his mouth, shaky with relief, and kissed him again, fierce and grateful, and around them the crowd's murmuring slowly settled into something less scandalized and more simply curious, a few of the younger townsfolk even offering scattered, startled applause, as if they had just watched the resolution of some story they hadn't known they were following. The old woman from the bathhouse steps, Elijah noticed over Mazoga's shoulder, was watching them with her mouth pressed into a thin, unreadable line, but she said nothing this time, and turned away toward the market stalls without another word, and he decided that was victory enough for one morning. News of what had happened in the square spread through Sable Vent faster than any fire, and in the days that followed, Elijah found the town's opinion of him shifting in ways he had not expected. Some of the older folk remained cool, unwilling to forgive so quickly the old wounds between their peoples, but far more of the town, he found, had simply been waiting for someone to prove that the border between human and orc did not have to be a wall. Farmers who had never spoken more than a trade word to him now stopped by the forge to clap him on the shoulder and ask, with careful curiosity, what an orc claiming mark actually meant, and whether it was true that Mazoga Stonefist had faced down a whole war band without flinching. Fishwives who had once eyed Mazoga with suspicion now nodded to her at the market stalls, and one, an older woman with sun-weathered hands, even pressed a jar of preserved lemons into her arms and told her, gruffly, that any woman who stood her ground against Ironjaw's whole war band deserved better neighbors than she'd had. Not everyone came around, of course. There remained a hard core of townsfolk who muttered when Mazoga passed, who whispered that Elijah had brought trouble to Sable Vent's door that would follow them for years, that the mark on his throat was an invitation for every disgruntled orc chieftain in the north to test the town's defenses. Elijah did not pretend those voices did not sting some mornings when he caught them muttering near the market stalls. But he found he minded them less than he might have expected, with Mazoga's hand so often in his, with the mark at his throat a constant, warm reminder of exactly what he had chosen and why. Mazoga, for her part, seemed lighter after that morning in the square, some old tension gone out of her shoulders that Elijah had not fully noticed until it was absent. She dove the vent pools each morning with her usual fierce competence, but she laughed more easily now, teased him more openly, and did not flinch any more at the sight of riders on the harbor road, because there was nothing left for any rider to threaten that had not already been settled plainly, permanently, before the whole town. "I never thought I would want this," she confessed to him one evening, weeks later, sitting close against his side on the black rocks above the harbor while the sun set copper and gold over the steaming water, the volcano's distant vents glowing faint orange against the darkening sky. A life in one place, a person to come back to every evening instead of just a net and a knife and my own 2 hands to rely on. What changed your mind? "You fell into my net," she said, "soaked to the bone, cradling my own fish against your chest like you thought you were rescuing something precious. I have never in my life seen anything so foolish or so unexpectedly dear." She turned to look at him, and there was nothing guarded in her expression at all now, nothing held back. "I did not choose you because I needed saving, Elijah Ford. I have never needed saving, not from Iron Joe, not from this whole hard world. I chose you because you were worth choosing, because you stood beside me instead of behind me, and because your steel holds an edge, and because you make me laugh in a way I had forgotten I still could." "I chose you for about 100 reasons," Elijah said, "but mostly because you looked at me like I mattered that very first morning, when half this town still doesn't know what to make of me. Nobody's looked at me like that in a long time. Maybe ever." "Then we are well matched," she said, and kissed him, slow and warm, the last of the sunset fading into the deep violet dusk around them, the hot spring steaming gently at the harbor's edge, and Elijah thought that he had never in his whole life felt so thoroughly and completely wanted. Summer gave way to the first cool edges of autumn in Sable Vent, the volcanic valley's air turning crisp at the mountain passes, even as the hot springs kept the harbor steaming warm year-round. And Elijah's forge stayed busy through the season, more so than it had ever been, as word of the smith who had stood against a chieftain's war band and won an orc diver's heart spread along the trade roads and brought curious buyers from towns further south, some eager to see his steel for themselves, some simply eager to catch a glimpse of the couple half the border valley now told stories about. Mazoga did not care for the attention, not really, though she bore it with a wry humor that Elijah found endlessly endearing, rolling her eyes whenever some traveling merchant asked too many questions about the mark at his throat or the fight that hadn't quite happened in the square. She kept diving the vent pools each morning regardless, kept hauling her nets full of silver fish to the market stalls, because it was honest work and it was hers, chieftain's bride debt or no, and Elijah loved her all the more for refusing to let any of it change the shape of her days. There was one more test that autumn, smaller than the warband's visit but sharper in its own way, when a trading caravan came through Sable Vent carrying a lowland merchant who took one look at the mark on Elijah's throat and made some loud, ugly comment in the market square about human men who let themselves be branded like cattle by orc women, loud enough for half the stalls to hear. Elijah felt the old shame trying to rise in him, the instinct to duck his head and let it pass, and then he felt Mazoga's hand settle firm and warm on his shoulder, and he found he did not want to duck his head at all. "Say that again," Mazoga said, stepping up beside the merchant's cart with a calm, dangerous ease that made the man's face go pale. "And tell me plainly what you think branding means, merchant, since you clearly do not understand the word." "I meant no offense," the merchant stammered, eyeing her considerable height and the diving knife at her belt. "You meant exactly the offense you gave," she said. "But I will forgive it this once because you are a stranger to this valley and do not yet understand how things stand here." She reached up, unhurried, and traced one finger lightly along the mark at Elijah's throat, proprietary and warm, her eyes never leaving the merchant's face. "This is not a brand. This is a promise, given by my own choice and taken by his, and it has stood against a chieftain's warband already this season and won. You would do well to speak more carefully of things you do not understand, in a town that has already made its peace with what we are." The merchant mumbled an apology and hurried his cart along, and Elijah caught the eye of several nearby stall keepers, who were not hiding their approval nearly as well as they perhaps intended, and one of the fishwives even called out, "Well said, Stonefist," as the merchant's cart rattled off down the harbor road. "You didn't need to do that," Elijah murmured, echoing deliberately the words she had said to him that very first morning by the tide pool. "I know," she said, echoing his own answer back at him with a grin. "It did not stop me." He laughed, delighted despite himself, and pulled her down for a kiss right there in the market square, uncaring of the stares, because there was hardly a soul left in Sable Vent who had not already seen them kiss a dozen times over by now, and the ones who disapproved had mostly learned to keep their disapproval to themselves. As the season deepened, Elijah found himself thinking more and more about permanence, not the clan mark, which already sat unshakable and warm at his throat, but something else, something he did not quite have words for yet, some human custom of his own he wanted to offer her in turn, some way of saying plainly before the whole valley that he had chosen her every bit as fully as she had chosen him. He found his answer, in the end, in his forge, working late into a cold autumn night by lantern light, shaping a slender band of his finest steel, folded and quenched with the same care he had given her diving knife all those months ago, set with a single small polished stone the deep amber gold of her eyes, found along the black volcanic shoreline where she dove each morning. It was not an orc custom, this ring, but he thought perhaps it did not need to be, so long as it meant what he wanted it to mean. He gave it to her on the black rocks above the harbor at dusk, with the hot springs steaming gently below and the first cold stars coming out overhead, and he did not make a long speech of it, because he had never been a man for long speeches, only steady hands and honest work. "I know your people have their own way of marking a bond," he said, turning the small steel ring over in his fingers before offering it to her, "and I already wear that mark, and I'm proud of it every day. But I wanted to give you something too, something that says the same thing in my own way, that I chose you, that I'll keep choosing you every morning for as long as you'll have me." Mazoga looked at the ring for a long moment, her throat working, and when she looked up at him her eyes were bright with something he had never seen in them before, not even in their fiercest, most tender moments. "I have never worn a human's ring," she said low. "There's a first time for most things," he said, "for both of us this year." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit, because he had measured it carefully weeks before under the pretense of admiring her strong diver's hands, and she stared at it glinting in the fading light, the amber stone catching the last color of the sunset, and then she pulled him into her arms and kissed him with a fierceness that stole the breath clean out of him. "I choose you too," she said against his mouth, fierce and certain. "Every morning. For as long as this valley stands, and longer than that, if the old stories about love outlasting stone are worth anything at all." They stayed out on the black rocks long after the stars came out fully, wrapped together against the cooling autumn air, the hot springs steaming below them, and Elijah thought that he had never in his whole life imagined a moment quite so complete, quite so thoroughly, permanently his. Almost a year to the day after Elijah had fallen face first into Mazoga Stonefist's fishing net, Sable Vent held its Autumn Harbor Festival, a tradition older than the town's living memory, when the fish buyers and the divers and the whole harbor community gathered on the black rocks and the market square to celebrate the season's catch with music and shared food, and the kind of loose, warm goodwill that came easiest when the hot springs were steaming gentle and golden under a clear sky. Elijah closed the forge early that day, for once, and found Mazoga already down at the harbor, not diving this time but sitting on the rocks with her net folded beside her, watching the festival preparations with an ease in her posture that still, some mornings, caught him by surprise, the ease of a woman who had found, against every hard old history between their peoples, a place that had finally truly become home. She wore her sealskin diving leathers still, laced snug at her waist, sea salt drying faint at her collarbone, and at her finger the small steel ring caught the afternoon light, and at her throat when she turned to smile at him, he could just see the edge of a matching mark, given quietly some months back, a mirror to the one she had given him, because clan tradition allowed for the binding to run both ways when both hearts meant it fully, and she had wanted, she'd told him, for anyone who looked at either of them to know exactly and permanently how things stood. "You closed the forge," she said, as he settled onto the rocks beside her. "For a festival you have grumbled about attending every year I have known you. I didn't grumble every year. You grumbled this very morning. That was before I remembered it's the anniversary," he said, and watched her face soften because she had remembered too, he could tell from the particular warmth in her eyes. "A year since I fell in your net." "A year since you fell in my net," she agreed, and somehow caught something far more troublesome than fish. She reached over and laced her fingers through his, her grip warm and sure, the amber ring glinting between them. "I did not expect that morning that I would end this year with a smith's mark at my throat and his ring at my finger, and a whole town that has mostly stopped whispering when we walk past." "Mostly," he agreed, laughing. "There will always be some who whisper," she said, more serious now, watching the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gentle in the steaming water, where children ran laughing along the rocks and old fishwives strung festival lanterns between the stalls. "Some old wars do not end easily, not even at borders like this one, where both peoples have learned, mostly, to share the same water. But I have stopped fearing the whispers, Elijah. I do not think I feared them so much, even at the start, as I feared being alone in facing them." "You're not alone," he said, simple and certain, the same promise he had made 100 times over that year in 100 small ways, standing beside her in the square against Ironjaw's warband, forging her knives and her rings, sitting up with her through the nights she still, sometimes, dreamed of the clan she had left behind. "You're not ever going to be alone again if I've got any say in it." "You have considerable say in it," she said, and kissed him unhurried and warm, there on the black rocks with the festival music starting to drift up from the square, fiddles and hand drums and the low rolling laughter of a town that had, mostly, made its peace with the shape of their love. "I chose you, Smith. I choose you still. I will go on choosing you, I think, for as long as either of us has breath left to argue about it." "I'm counting on that," he said, and pulled her closer, and they sat together on the black rocks above the steaming harbor as the festival lanterns came alight one by one in the gathering dusk, the volcano's distant vents glowing faint orange against a darkening violet sky, the whole valley smelling of salt and sulfur and wood smoke, and Elijah thought, watching the ring glint at her finger and the mark rest easy at her throat, that he had never once, in all his years of solitary hammering and quiet loneliness, imagined he might end up here chosen, wanted, needed, by a woman who could have had her pick of anyone in 2 people's worth of warriors and chieftains, and who had looked at him. Instead, soaked and fish-scaled and utterly unremarkable, and decided, against every old grudge and every hard border, that he was worth keeping. Down in the square, someone struck up a livelier tune, and the fishwives began to dance, and children shrieked with delight as the first festival fireworks cracked bright and gold against the darkening sky, reflected in 100 rippling fragments across the steaming harbor water. Mazoga rose and pulled Elijah up after her, tugging him down toward the square with a grin that still, after a whole year, made his heart trip over itself. "Come, Smith," she said, "dance with me, properly this time, not falling into any nets." "I make no promises," he said, laughing, letting her pull him along, "about the falling." "Good," she said, glancing back at him over her shoulder, her amber eyes bright with firelight and pure unguarded happiness. "I rather liked it the first time. I would not mind if you kept falling for me, Elijah Ford, for the rest of both our days." "I already have," he said, catching up to loop his arm around her waist as they reached the square. "I think I fell the moment I looked up out of that tide pool and saw you laughing down at me." "Then we are agreed," she said, turning into his arms as the music swelled around them, the whole town's warmth and light and noise wrapping close around the two of them like something as steady and lasting as the volcanic stone beneath the harbor itself. We fell together, and I do not intend to let either of us climb back out. They danced there in the square until the fireworks faded and the lanterns burned low, surrounded by a town that had learned, slowly and imperfectly but truly, to make room for a love that crossed every old border it had ever been told could not be crossed. And when Elijah finally walked her home that night, back along the harbor road past the steaming vent pools where it had all begun, his hand in hers, her mark warm at his throat and his ring bright at her finger, he felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and completely unafraid of what tomorrow might bring, because whatever it was, he would not be facing it alone, not ever again, not so long as Mazoga Stonefist had any say in the matter, and she had made abundantly, permanently clear that she intended to have quite a lot of say in it, for a very long time to come.